Welcome back to HALLOWEEK. HALLOWEEK is a tradition I do every year on this channel where I pick a Halloween themed topic and I talk about the psychology of it. You guys voted on this year's HALLOWEEK topic. You really wanted the psychology of fairies by a landslide, so here we have it. To tell you the truth, this is a complicated topic because fairies and fairy adjacent legends come from all over the world, and our modern image of the fairy is such a mix of so many cultures and legends that I really feel it's a complex topic, kind of hard to boil down to one essence, but I'm going to try my best. We're going to talk about the history of the fairy legend, and then we're going to talk about the psychology of it, what the fairy legend reveals about those of us who entertain it. So fairies are a legendary anthropomorphic being. Usually they're smaller than human spirits who live in wild places like forests and caves and underground. They also sometimes have wings and can fly, as well as magical abilities. And the legend of the fairy comes from Celtic, Slavic, Germanic, French, Romanian folklore. I even see a lot of similarities between some of these legends and others that I've never actually heard spoken about in relation to fairies, like the Hawaiian menehune. Now, there are a lot of different theories about where the legend of the fairy came from. One is that fairies used to be revered as deities, that they were pagan gods and goddesses that later got demoted into just being seen as like these magical spirits, but not as powerful as they used to be. Other theories say that fairies are the first people, the prehistoric people. And another theory is that fairies are elementals. They're nature spirits who can control the forces of nature, like the water, the wind, and so forth. Some have speculated that the legend of the fairy might be derived at its core from the Peris of Persian mythology. They were these beautiful pre-Islamic nature spirits that had wings, and that perhaps that Paris legend was brought to Europe somehow, or transmitted to Europe. There were also fairy-like creatures in ancient Greek mythology, like dryads and nymphs, spirits of the trees and rivers. But perhaps one of the cultures with the most salient fairy legend is Irish culture, Celtic culture. According to Irish folklore, the Tuatha De Danann were the original people of Ireland, until the Celts drove them underground. And so they used their magical abilities to become the Is She. And some people genuinely believe that fairies were a real race of people, that they hid in forests and caves when more advanced tribes that had metal weaponry invaded them. It would explain why in a lot of legends, fairies are said to be afraid of iron. If they were truly a group of people and not magical spirits as we assume, then it makes sense that if they had never seen iron before and they knew it was dangerous, it would be scary to them. And the people who believe this also say that it's possible fairies might have started stealing food and maybe even babies and playing tricks on the invaders, and that could be why fairies have this reputation as mischievous tricksters. In early Christianity, the link between paganism and fairy legends was very strong, to the point where anytime you found fairies, they were considered pagan, and anything pagan was overall associated with fairies. And of course, because Christianity demonized a lot of pagan concepts, sometimes fairies were seen as demonic. Then Shakespeare popularized fairies with A Midsummer Night's Dream, and in the Renaissance and Victorian eras, there started to be a lot more artwork and stories that popped up depicting fairies. In the 20th century, fairies were even a component of Disney princess stories, and they're still very popular today. I mean, they're like one of the biggest topics in romantasy books at the moment. So clearly this is a legend that really speaks to us on a primordial level. But we can't really talk about fairies without distinguishing between the two different kinds of fairies. And this is where I think talking about my own Romanian culture might come in handy. So in Romanian, we have two types of fairies. We have zâne, which are basically like fairy godmothers, benevolent fairies, and we have ele, which are not so nice fairies. It's kind of parallel to the difference between the mermaid and the siren, you know, the Little Mermaid, Ariel, versus the true legend of the siren, which was a lot more gory and ruthless than the child-palatable version we have today. So zâne, like I said, are similar to the fairy godmother archetype. The word zână actually comes from dzina, which comes from Diana, the goddess. Diana, the goddess of nature, of hunters, of wildlife, of childbirth, fertility, crossroads, because they're liminal spaces betwixt and between, so therefore they're magical, of the night, of the moonlight. Diana was virgin goddess and protector of childbirth. It was said that she could give life to fetuses in utero, and that she was kind of like a guardian angel or fairy godmother for infants. She could bestow gifts to children, but if a person has the power to bestow gifts to someone, they also have the power for the shadow aspect of that, to bring on a curse. And this is where we get the legend of Yele, not so nice fairies. They lure men to the forest, they can be seductive, they're enchantresses. And if you stumble across them dancing in a horror circle, you are not going to get out of there alive. Most likely they're going to make you dance until you die. Zine reflect the quintessence of the goddess Diana, like I said, but Yele reflect more of the quintessence of the god Dionysus, the god of wine, debauchery, fruitfulness, shameless sexuality, ecstasy. And this dichotomy reflects the two sides of every coin. If you have the power to bestow and bless life, then you also have the power to curse it and to take it away. It's kind of like the duality between the conscious self and the unconscious self, the persona and the shadow self. The two aspects of the self coexist within the same person. It's very different from how in Abrahamic religions we see as good and evil completely separate, God and Satan, God and devil. That is more of a type of psychological splitting that doesn't really allow people to fully integrate themselves, to acknowledge the good and the evil within. Back in pagan times, gods were multifaceted. Even Diana herself was multifaceted. Even Dionysus was multifaceted. It consisted of contrasts. They were both the protectors and the wreakers of havoc. And just the same, the legend of the fairy contains both Zune and Yele. Now, the qualities of fairies are usually they're pretty mischievous, they like to play tricks on humans, sometimes in quite macabre ways. They're protectors of nature and innocence, particularly children, particularly anyone that would harm nature. They tend to harm those people. They hold magical powers that can control nature, and they can wield that as a weapon. Usually they can fly, they have wings. They can be quite vengeful and unforgiving and ruthless. They can be appeased with offerings and superstitions. For example, if you put a garland of marigolds and primroses at your door, or wood of ash, rowan, and blackthorn, or a bag of clover around your neck, or you turn your coat inside out. All of these are said to be protection against fairies. And fairies also have a very multifaceted relationship with children. They're small, like children, which makes you think that maybe they're allies with children, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. Like I said, they can take on either a fairy godmother, kind of guardian angel type of role, particularly during childbirth and infancy, or on the other hand, sometimes they steal children and they replace them with the spirit of a fairy, and then they send them back to their family to unalive the entire family. Or they can curse children if their parents piss them off. Before modern medicine, fairies were often blamed for things like birth defects of infants. And back then, people actually believed that the fairies could steal a child and turn them into a changeling, a fairy baby. And according to some legends, like I said, the mother of that child would need to unalive this fairy baby that had usurped her own baby. It's the age-old biblical and beyond question of, would you kill your own child if you had to? So the psychology of the fairy legend. We see a lot of different archetypes within the fairy legend. One that's really prominent is the trickster. Mischievous, funny, there's some humor in it, but generally a chaos harbinger. Pranks, but pretty dark pranks. Another archetype that we see in fairies is the siren or the femme fatale. Part of my reluctance to talk about fairies is because I already did a video on sirens and I find them to be very similar in their archetype. Fairies are basically just a land siren. Sometimes there are even freshwater fairies, like in the forest, that completely bridge the two. They're both fairy and siren because they are nature spirits, they exist in the woods, but also they're in bodies of water as well. And like any siren archetype, they tend to be quite seductive, they're seen as enchantresses, vengeful, dangerous, deceptive, they lure people to their death, they trick them. Fairies also embody the archetype of the guardian, or the protector of nature and innocence, such as Morgana Le Fay in Arthurian legends, such as the fairy godmother in Cinderella, And of course, it's shadow side, like Maleficent who curses Aurora in Sleeping Beauty. And fairies also kind of embody the archetype of the child because they're playful, they're diminutive, they're like physically small, they kind of look like a child, they're innocent looking. So there are a lot of different archetypes mixed into the fairy legend. But what does it all mean? What does it say about us that we've created this legend? Assuming it's not real, which, some of you might think that it is real, and that's fine. Particularly when we talk about fairies as protectors of nature and vengeful against humans who would hurt nature. I think it's a reminder of our rejected primordial roots, the parts of us that we've relegated underground to the unconscious. Just like the Tuatha de Danann were sent underground by the Celts, so too we sometimes forget our roots and we push parts of ourselves in the unconscious and we repress them. It could be a cautionary tale against getting so technologically advanced that we cease to respect Mother Nature and that we might need to atone for it. And interestingly, I hear this kind of fear on all sides of the political spectrum. Anytime there is a natural disaster that takes place, I look at the comments under those videos of the natural disasters, and usually it's like conservative Christians saying things like, the Bible foretold this, you guys are going to see destruction is coming, we need to atone for our sins. And on the other hand, you'll usually see atheist liberal people commenting similar kinds of doomsday sentiments of like, we're all going to die because of climate change. It's the same fear in both groups of people. It just shows up differently because of the meaning they make of these experiences. Fairies also reflect kind of an animistic view. The elements and pieces of nature contain spiritual meaning. They're kind of like spiritual entities. We personify them as being fairies. It's a personification of nature and a healthy fear of her because, again, like Mother Nature, we personify our planet because it helps us think about how she must be feeling certain things and she must have certain intentions and certain drives. It helps us make sense of what happens to us because we think, well, this is Mother Nature's doing. She's angry with us. She wants us out of here. But putting aside nature for a moment from a purely Jungian perspective, I think legends where we speak about shunning fairies underground are basically just a warning against shunning our shadow selves, against splintering parts of us that will come back if left unattended. The shadow self is, again, a personification of everything that we reject about ourselves. And if we don't tend to it, and if we don't pull out parts of it and incorporate it into our conscious selves, and if we don't practice compassion for the parts of us that we reject, then it's going to turn into a monster and it's going to come back to haunt us. Fairies reflect the seductive allure of the unconscious. It pulls us into the depths of the wilderness and we may go mad once we stumble on something we've uncovered. Or it could be more literal. In the case of the femme fatale siren archetype, it could literally boil down to how some people, particularly men, fear female seduction and see it as very dangerous and powerful. Now, as to fairies' relationship with children, the idea of changelings, of protection versus curses for children, of stealing children, this is where I think the legend of the fairy has a bit of a darker psychological meaning. We could look at it a number of different ways. One is that the fearful legends around fairies bringing harm to children reflects new parents' fears about being able to protect their children from the elements of the world, from the forces of nature. It's kind of like powerlessness and knowing that at the end of the day, you can't ever 100% protect your children, and that's just a reality you have to accept. Or it may reflect new parents' fears about how their kid's going to turn out. Is it going to have a curse? Or is it going to have gifts bestowed upon the child? In other words, I think it boils down to parents wanting to know what is going to be the temperament of my child. Are they going to have some sort of personality or mental disorder? Are they going to be smart? Are they going to be kind? Like, who decides these things? The legend of the fairy kind of grasps at different explanations of, oh, my child is so great because the fairy godmother is protecting him, or my child is cursed because an evil fairy put a curse on him because she was mad at me. But changelings, I think, reflect something even darker psychologically, which is a parent's fear that their child might be evil and their inability to recognize them as their own. And this happens in animals all the time. I remember like a couple years ago, I went to a reindeer farm in Washington, and there was an adorable little baby reindeer who was rejected by its mom, and it was suspected that it might not even survive because of it, because of whatever reasons, because of traumatic childbirth or different reasons on the mom's part. Sometimes animals are rejected by their mothers. It also happens sometimes with postpartum too. It's not a fun topic to talk about, but sometimes when undergoing postpartum depression, moms struggle to connect with their children and they kind of see it as like, who is this kid? Like, this isn't mine. Like, what creature is this? Or sometimes we see it with deadbeat dads. Like, I was just recently rewatching this episode of The Sopranos where Ralphie did the thing with his stripper Gumar. I'm not going to go into it because it's such a disturbing scene. But what did he say after the fact? He said, she wasn't even carrying my kid, you know? He had kind of rejected his own child before it was even born because he didn't want to be a father. So I think sometimes the legend of the changeling reflects these fears that, you know, when your child comes, you might not be able to want them. You might not recognize them as your own, and you might have to do unspeakable things to protect yourself and the rest of your family. In other cases, I think it can also reflect the way that some children are scapegoated in the family system, particularly in narcissistic family structures. One kid is chosen as the scapegoat to serve almost as like social glue for the rest of the family. That kid is considered the bad apple, all bad, and the only way to rid the whole family of destruction is to push that scapegoat as far away and to harm them and to see them as all bad. I think this very much reflects a real and common dynamic that we see in narcissistic families. So there we have it. That is the psychology of fairies from my perspective at this point in time. You guys always have the best insights about HALLOWEEK, so I'd be really curious what you thought about this and if you have any additional theories and interpretations of the legend of the fairy. Also, if you come from a culture where you believe in fairies, I'd also really love to hear about that. I hope you have a wonderful Halloween, and I will see you soon.